All right. Well, thank you everyone for being here. My name is Michael Chato. I'm the Executive Director of the New Israel Fund. I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm calling in today from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, recognizing sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I can still see people trickling in. Thank you so much for joining us on this Sunday night. It's great to have you all, and thank you to our panelists who we'll introduce shortly. Extra special thank you to my colleague Amy Grossbard and to Rotem Newsom for making this all happen. It's wonderful to have this conversation. It's of course less wonderful the circumstances under which we're having this conversation. Um, there's unfortunately too much to discuss. The attacks on democracy are too broad and too wide-ranging to name in this brief introduction. I'll say that it's certainly no coincidence that these are occurring at the same time as the war. The war has resumed, of course, the ceasefire and hostage deals have lapsed, and since that period, more lives have been tragically lost in Gaza. Too many to name, too many innocent civilians have paid this horrible price for this ongoing war. Too many hostages remain in Gaza, have not been brought home, have not been made safer by the resumption of this war. And indeed, we know that the far-right Netanyahu government is not putting the needs of the hostages, the well-being of Gazan civilians first. Smotrich has said as much, has bragged as much in recent days. And of course, Itamar Ben-Gvir visiting New York is similarly doing the same, bragging about the humanitarian toll in Gaza and his ability to wreak such havoc. This is all occurring at the same time as the introduction of the NGO bill that would tax too many NIF grantees, too many wonderful civil society organizations at a stifling 80%. This would be catastrophic, to say the least, for civil society in Israel, for democracy in Israel. It's happening while the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, is trying to fire the security chief, the attorney general. Again, the list goes on. I won't list all of the attacks on democracy. We have experts here to do that for us. So thank you, Gidon and Noah, for being here to represent EcoPeace and ACRI. I'll let our wonderful moderator introduce them, but I just want to say a special thank you to all of you for being here. Please do stick around for this important conversation, and please do fill out the survey that will drop into the chat to hear how this was from all of you at the end of this conversation. For now, I want to introduce our moderator, Dr. Michelle Lesh. Dr. Michelle Lesh is an international lawyer, as taught at the Melbourne Law School and the London School of Economics, worked at the United Nations and is a member of the International Bar Association War Crimes Committee. She has written for a variety of academic and non-academic publications, including the Jewish Independent, and most importantly, is on the NIF International Advisory Council. Michelle, thank you so much for being here. I'll hand it over to you to introduce our panelists.
Thanks, Michael. And thanks everyone for joining us tonight. It's an honor to host this timely, important, and for many of us painful conversation about the attack on democracy behind the veil of the Gaza war from two leading activists and leaders in Israeli society who will share their invaluable insights and no doubt inspire us. It's my privilege to introduce them. We have with us Rabbi Noah Sattath, who was appointed the Executive Director of the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, ACRI, in 2001. Prior to that, she ran the Israel Religious Action Center, IRAC, where she was responsible for leading public strategy on religion and state, gender equality, and the struggle against racism. Prior to her work at IRAC, Noah directed the Jerusalem Open House for Pride and Tolerance, where she was a partner in the historic process of leading the city's inaugural Pride marches. Furthermore, Noah served as the CEO of MEET, an organisation that uses technology to develop joint leadership amongst Israelis and Palestinian youth from Israel and the West Bank. Noah is a certified Reform Rabbi and has a master's degree in Jewish studies. So thank you, Noah, for joining us tonight. And our other panelist tonight is Gidon Bromberg, who is the co-founder of EcoPeace Middle East since 1994, and he's served as its Israel director for 3 decades. Mr. Bromberg, an attorney by profession, is an alumni of our very own Monash University in Australia, Washington College of Law at American University, and Yale University's World Fellows Program. Mr. Bromberg has been immersed in the environmental peace-building world for over 30 years and has written extensively on the relationship between water issues and Middle East peace. He has presented on these issues before UN Climate Summit, UN Security Council, US Congress, European Parliament, and in other local and international forums. Gidon is a member of the jury of the prestigious Goldman Environmental Award. So I want to welcome both our panelists tonight, and I'll quickly just introduce some of the main themes that we intend to cover and then hand over to the two people that we're all here to listen to, Noah and Gidon. And we will be leaving time at the end for questions from the audience, so please type them into the chat function and I'll get through as many of them as I can. I'd like to start this conversation by both of you telling us briefly about your work and your organisations. And then, if you agree, we can discuss what effect the war has had on major institutions at this current moment and also in the future. The major institutions of a democratic government are the parliament, the media, the judiciary, education, defence and security forces, whose integrity and independence from the government of the day and others depend on this. Once we have discussed those institutions, I'd like to know from you whether you think there are other important organisations that you think that we should be looking at, some of the ones that make up civil society, for example. And I also want to talk about the importance of individual responsibility and agency and connect that to the role of civil society. And I suggest that we keep before us as a guiding thought in this discussion that democratic societies can be pretty terrible and still be no less democratic. We can't assume that every important ethical concern we have about society is about its democratic nature. So, for example, whether the Defence Forces commits war crimes is obviously a very serious matter, but it's not necessarily something that undermines democracy. And again, it's something we might delve in further throughout the conversation. But I want to start, if you can each tell us about your work, your organisation, particularly post-October 7, and also at this pertinent moment in time, and your future efforts in light of what is occurring on the ground. Noah, do you want to start?
Sure. So hello, everybody. Thank you, everyone, for joining. ACRI is the largest and most veteran human and civil rights organization in Israel, and also the only one that is advocating across the spectrum of civil and human rights, from women's rights and LGBT rights to prisoners' rights and police dealing with police brutality and freedom of expression, to issues of human and civil rights of the Arab minority within Israel, and human rights in the West Bank, and then now in Gaza as well. The breadth of our work is quite large, and we pride ourselves in being involved in most of the precedent-setting cases around human and civil rights in Israel. Since the beginning of the war, our role has become much harder in many cases, and because we've been around for 52, 53 years, we know that we become less effective during wartime. The courts are less likely to rule in our favor. The public doesn't like to discuss human rights during times of war. And so in the beginning of the war, we were kind of like everybody anticipating that it would be a few weeks, and then we would return to our normal position in society and our normal impact. But because the war is unprecedentedly long and we don't see an end in sight, we are now trying to make an impact during war, which is extremely difficult. We've been to the Supreme Court in Israel over 60 times since the beginning of the war, witnessing a collapse of all human and civil rights, from freedom of protest to prisoners' rights to the rights of the hundreds of thousands of Israelis who were evacuated from their homes, to the deterioration of the democratic institutions and the um, war crimes in the West, war crimes in Gaza, and the deterioration of the situation in the West Bank. So we've been trying to cover all of that while both carrying a lot of pain and grief ourselves, and trying um, to deal with a lot more hostility than usual. So I'll just end with this little story in the beginning of the war, and still now, but to a lesser degree, we're dealing with a lot of blockades around different villages in the West Bank, which is a huge denial of civil and human rights if people can't leave their houses to go to work and study and access medical help if they need it. And a few days after the war began, I was interviewing on that issue with a reporter from the US and trying to give all the details, and there were hundreds of different blockades, and I did not have all the information. So I told him, listen, let me text you the number of the lawyer who's dealing with the case, and she'll give you all the information because I'm getting entangled here. And then I hang up the phone, and I remembered that our chief lawyer for the West Bank issues was doing advocacy that day because her sister-in-law had been kidnapped. So she was, trying to meet with different prime ministers who were visiting Israel. So I texted him, that the reporter, I texted him, listen, the lawyer may not be available right away. Text her and she'll get back to you. She's advocating today because her sister-in-law has been kidnapped. And he called me right back and said, her sister-in-law has been kidnapped, and what she's doing now is advocating for human rights in the West Bank. And for us, the answer has always been yes. We can hold the pain, and we can hold it. It's very hard. It's not easy. We can hold the pain and the commitment to human rights at the same time. And that's what we've been struggling to do every day since October 7th. And we have a long way to be holding that as well.
Beautifully
So I
put,
could really build
Gidon.
on what Noah has spoken about, but from a very different perspective, because EcoPeace Middle East is a very different organization. Firstly, we're not a human rights organization; we're a peace building organization, and there is a real difference there. And what's unique about EcoPeace is that we're not an Israeli organization; we're a regional organization. We're Israeli, Palestinian, and Jordanian together. In fact, we're the only organization that exists in any field where our board, made up of Palestinian, Jordanian, and Israeli board members, are representing and governing a single organization. I'm the Israeli director of the organization and a co-founder, but I run the organization together with my Palestinian co-director in Ramallah and my Jordanian co-director in Amman. And when we think about what's happened to the region, since for these horrific some 17 months after October 7th, we've all, like Noah, we've all lost loved ones in all of our offices. With some of our offices, some family members, some staff losing 100 family members, yet they remain committed as Israelis, Palestinians, and Jordanians to work together for peace, for our particular focus of using the environment, because that's what EcoPeace, eco being the ecology aspect, using the environment to advance peace. And we have taken on different roles. We've certainly changed our strategy following October 7th. We started working with displaced Israeli families and taking them to nature in order to help relieve some of the psychological pain that they were going through. And through our Ramallah office, started to buy water in Gaza and start to distribute it to people that no longer had access to water. And our advocacy efforts have been and remain in the wash sector, in the water and sanitation and public health sector, where we've led advocacy to reopen water pipelines. So on October 8th, the Israeli Minister of Defense called to close the 3 pipelines that were selling water from Israel into Gaza, and that's the largest source of water for the population in Gaza. Certainly, the best source of clean water for that population. And we started working with health professionals. In fact, Israel's leading heads of public health schools, and writing letters to the War Cabinet, highlighting that this is wrong, that we can't stop water flow. We shouldn't close the water pipelines, but also highlighting the implications to the Israeli public, because we know that, as Noah said, in a time of war, it's very hard to talk about moral issues. So we heavily focused also on self-interest, and we're able to bring home the message to Israeli decision makers that closing the water and not allowing fuel to enter Gaza, certainly on sanitation issues, will boomerang back to the Israeli public and the outbreak of pandemic disease. And that's why we chose to work with Israel's leading health professionals so that we could get the expert letters out there to the War Cabinet. And within a week, the first pipeline was reopened. Within another 2 weeks, the second pipeline. And that's a very significant amount of the water that became available for the Palestinian population in Gaza. It took us longer to open the third pipeline in the north, but that too eventually was opened. And also fuel. And clearly we weren't here alone. We were working with the then American administration, who were very much aligned with our views, and we were able to work with the international community and with the Americans to get that type of advocacy out there. And eventually, when we saw the quote of the head of the National Security Council in Israel justifying why Israel would allow fuel to come back to Gaza, he actually quotes the letter that we co-authored, where he doesn't give us any credit. That's fine. He speaks to pandemic disease more likely to break out in Gaza, and that it wouldn't stop in Gaza, and therefore the need to return water and to return fuel. So the nature of our advocacy, the nature of our community efforts has changed, but we've also, and I think I'd like to speak to that perhaps later, we've also really tried to think out of the box and to go beyond our more general approach of the environment, and understand that we also need the environment and geopolitical issues, but we also need to touch on security in order to speak to the fears of the public on both sides, on all sides. We also deal with the Jordanians. So we've really tried to think out of the box, and at the same time heavily invest in our staff. So for over a year, we hired therapists for each office. For over a year, we hired a mindfulness expert from Sri Lanka that worked with each office separately, with the leadership team together, and then with each department together, to understand that there are various degrees, but all of us are suffering. And only when we could accept our own suffering and the recognition of the suffering of the others could we truly then represent the type of peace building work, could we successfully express the type of peace building work that we aim to achieve.
Thank you both for outlining so eloquently the work of your important organisations. And I think something that came out so powerfully in both your descriptions is the way your organizations have continued to fight for the rights of all individuals and see the suffering and try and protect the dignity of all, at the same time holding on to your own grief and own pain, which is not an easy thing. And I want to try and talk about how your organizations have kind of struggled in kind of particular ways with the big institutions in a democracy, which in the case of Israel have been eroded most spectacularly since the war. We know also since before the war. And Gershon Gorenberg recently wrote in The Atlantic, and I'm going to read a short quote here. He said, "If any doubts remain that Benjamin Netanyahu aims to transform Israel into an authoritarian state where the prime minister is above the law and dissent is presumed subversive, an 8-page affidavit submitted to the country's Supreme Court this week should dispel them." Now, Gorenberg is referring, as we know, to the affidavit written by Ronen Bar, the former head of the Shin Bet security agency, who in an unprecedented move was sacked by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu has also sacked the defense minister, the chief of staff, and is trying desperately to sack the attorney general. And I'd like to ask each of you how you think things have been going with respect to these institutions that I mentioned previously, for example, the judiciary or the media or education, in light of your own work. So Noah, if you want to talk about your experience with you mentioned 60 petitions to the Supreme Court over the duration of the war, which is, I can't even imagine that workload for your organization.
Yes.
It's massive. And just recently, the petition you were part of that was challenging the legality of Israel's policy of humanitarian aid to Gaza was rejected by the court. So if you want to talk to one of your experiences with the erosion of institutions and Gidon, whether peace building has been affected in different ways by institutions or education or awareness or things like that. So Gidon, do you want to start first, or Noah? Either one of you, whoever wants to jump in.
Go ahead, Noah.
Noah.
All right. So in terms of the attacks on democratic institutions, I don't think that I needed the document from Ronen Bar to dispel any illusions about Benjamin Netanyahu. I think it was pretty clear before. But basically, there are several layers to the attack. One is, you may remember that when the government was sworn in January 2023, the Minister of Justice, Yariv Levin, described a package of 6 laws designed to basically strip away the judiciary from all its powers. And I think it's quite an extraordinary testament to the power of resistance that even though the government has had a majority to pass these laws since January 2023, only 2 laws have passed. One was passed and was reversed by the Supreme Court in a petition that ACRI was part of. And the second was passed just a few weeks ago in terms of the judicial nomination process. And we are appealing that as well. I think you never know going into court, but we have a good appeal, and we are optimistic about our chances of reversing that as well. So in terms of these monumental change to the judiciary, I think it's not going in the way that the government had hoped. But the government has many, many other tools. One is basically making the lives of the gatekeepers very difficult. And so we saw that it worked, and the chief of staff of the military has quit because he was just pushed too far. We saw that in the attempt to fire Ronen Bar, who is the head of the Shin Bet. And so for me, the head of the largest human rights organization, to be kind of speaking for the head of the secret police is really a sign of the bizarre times. But again, we are very worried about him being replaced by a yes man who would just do whatever the prime minister says. And we're also seeing that in the attempts to fire the attorney general. So these are important gatekeepers. They're by far, we have a lot of grievances against them because we are, from our perspective, they're not doing enough to protect the rights of Palestinians. But the fact that they are trying to stand up to the government is something that the government doesn't like. There's also a level of rhetoric, of incitement and rejection of norms that is against any gatekeepers, against the police, against the media, against the civil society. And we see it in our work that when we go to court now, we have to have protective presence because our lawyers are attacked going in and going out. We see that in very hostile environments in the Knesset when we show up. So it's been creating a hostile environment that takes a lot of resilience to continue to be in. And I was just watching before this morning, before this, well, for you it's night. Before the panel, I was watching the hearing that the Knesset was having with the Attorney General, and you see they have nothing on her, but they're just pestering her and creating a hostile environment, hoping to break her. And that means we need to be very strong together to not to be very strong against these types of hostile environments. Looking forward to the next Knesset session. The Knesset has been out of session for a few weeks for Passover, which has been very relaxing for us. But they're coming back into session next Sunday. And we at ACRI, we have, if anybody wants, it'll be on our website next Sunday. We're kind of mapping the landscape of threats that the new session will bring. And I think what we're seeing that they have maxed out on the judiciary. The plans for the next Knesset are on other gatekeepers. And we see kind of two parallel moves. One is they're trying to dismantle the current institutions, and they're building the infrastructure for authoritarian rule, allowing arrests without explanation, allowing barring of attorney-client meetings, banning all sorts of freedom of expression and allowing arrests. So they're basically setting up a new type of regime. And I want to, I'm going to go more deeply into all of these issues. And I want to say at the get-go, we know that some of this is declarative and some of this will progress into legislation. We don't know which. And from our perspective, because this is language that all of it is destined to delegitimize the work of democratic institutions, it's important to respond very forcefully to everything, even though we know not all of it will be progressed into legislation. So the next question is very focused on the media. There are many bills targeting public broadcast and other types of broadcast that is critical of the government, trying to defund them, trying to close them, trying to limit what they can do. There's really giving unprecedented powers to the police to open investigations, to close investigations against corruption, to scrutinize police people who are dealing with corruption and close the cases because they're trying to close cases against the government, to arrest people without proof, and to limit freedom of expression and basically see anybody who speaks out against the government as an enemy. And we're also seeing the attack on the NGOs and trying to defund NGOs, specifically NGOs dealing with the occupation.
So we indeed are in the middle of the heat of attack on NGOs, and particularly an NGO that is regional is often seen as an NGO that must be working for the enemy. Because if you're working with Palestinians, if you're working with Jordanians, and from the Arab world, if you're working with Israelis, then you must be working for the enemy. So we've seen And sadly, because we have operations, our offices are in Tel Aviv, in Ramallah, in Amman. Over these 30 years, authoritarian practices of trying to close our offices are not new to us. There's been attempts to close our offices, to shut down our bank accounts over these last 30 years. We have lost funding. The new Trump administration, in its first term, decided to cut all funding to peace-building organizations or to any organizations that are working with Palestinians. We lost $1 million of our funding 4 years ago. With this current US administration, we just lost $1.4 million from this year's budget, 25% of our financial resources. We see the settler movement being far more aggressive. We've successfully helped protect what is now a World Heritage Site in the West Bank around the village of Batir, south of Jerusalem, west of Bethlehem. And we see now 4 major development plans around this little village, and a complete rejection of the recognition that this is a World Heritage Site listed through the World Heritage Convention that Israel remains a member of. So we see the environment directly attacked, and EcoPeace has been subject to demonstrations in our other offices to actually close the organization down. Publicly calls to reject the very nature of peace building. On the other hand, I must say that much of our education work in all 3 countries continues, and it continues, and it actually remains oversubscribed. Partly, perhaps the ministers are not aware of what we're doing, but we literally do see support. We see support from the professional level in all the ministries that we work with, that they recognize that this type of cooperation, EcoPeace has better relations than most Israeli ministries with government authorities in Jordan. And various ministries will turn to us in order to maintain basic issues of public health that need to be dealt with in the midst of the war. And therefore, I think the unique position, the very professional role that we've established for ourselves, and our ability to continue that communication with government bodies on all 3 sides has somewhat protected us. But we are very fearful. I mean, should the Israeli government bill to tax 80%, that becomes a real disaster for our ability to operate, given that we're already subject to a tremendous economic loss with the closure of USAID funding. And this is not only for EcoPeace, this is for the whole peace building sector. USAID, in a bipartisan manner, the US Congress, Republicans and Democrats together established a fund for peace building. And that's the largest fund ever established to help advance Israeli-Palestinian peace. This has been shut down. And therefore, for peace building organizations, Israeli, Palestinian, and sort of broader region wide, this is a major setback, a major negative setback that, again, I think we can speak to later on in the conversation as to what people in Australia, what can the Australian government do to step up in this time.
I just want to follow up on that and say that the dismantling of USAID is devastating in our region and in every region. But that even more broadly, and I'm wondering, Gidon, if you agree, the US has been so involved in Israeli politics that it's like a check and balance in the system. It's like the judiciary, it's like the media. The even Let me just be clear that I don't think that they've done it in a perfect way, but they've been super involved in all issues. And now the abrupt way in which they're pulling out is another shock to our system. From our perspective, the US has been very involved in trying to tame or mitigate settler violence in the West Bank, and they're no longer doing that. They've been super involved in aid into Gaza. US generals have been sitting and monitoring every truck, what it has on it, where it's going, how it landed, and now all of that is gone. So for us, it's a much broader issue than just the disappearance of US aid, which is huge. And also there are new opportunities here. The US stepping back is a chance for others to step in.
Very much so. And our ability to lead advocacy on opening up, returning water to Gaza from Israel. Without the Americans, that would not have happened. It has to happen together. And this really empowers illiberal elements across the board in Israel. The closure of the U.S. Institute for Peace, the closure of the Woodrow Wilson Center for environment, or including environmental issues, it has real implications on our ability to interact and our ability to influence. And that means that does create opportunities for other actors. And this is where Australia should and can, not alone, but with other actors, step in.
It's a frightening picture that you've both painted for human rights organizations, NGOs, the attacks they're under as institutions are eroded. And there are things like the NGO bill, the USAID, and we see the way the dynamics with the US and the world we're all living in with Netanyahu and Trump in power is, as I said, such a frightening one. But what I did try and hold on to any bits of silver lining, and it's amazing that you're coming up with these kind of creative paths and relationships to navigate this really difficult terrain. And against that backdrop, I just want to turn to something that I found really moving in your first answers when you were describing your work more generally, which was I felt a real sense of personal responsibility in the way you described your work, your personal relationships, and your organization and your society. So I want to ask you whether you think there is a responsibility for individuals, because nowadays there's such an emphasis on structures of power, and that the ethical failings of society are often attributed to institutions rather than the behavior of individuals. Take the media, as Noel mentioned, which is such an important institution for democracy. And for example, many agree that the media has, for the most part, failed Israeli citizens, but it remains true that most of the citizens have access to information that the media doesn't provide. So if they're ignorant of serious matters, is that not also their responsibility? So I feel like there's this kind of juxtaposition about the picture we get of broader society and then the work of NGOs. And I was wondering how you see the role of the responsibility of the individual in a democracy.
That's a really interesting question. And so I think that in terms of the complete and utter failure of the media, I'm guessing that if we had, this conversation in theory, about a huge disaster that was happening in Australia, and Australian media is just not covering it at all. You can't see it. So, I think both of us would assume that people would be turning to Canadian sources or American sources. And, in Australia, there isn't even a language barrier. But it turns out that most people don't do it. Most people trust in their own media. And the disentanglement from that takes a long time. And when the media fails so completely, uh, and again, it's responsibility is for everybody. All of us are responsible for what is happening, and all of us need um, to make every effort and every creative path to figure out every creative path to change. Um, but in a surprising way, um, the traditional media is still extremely significant in what people take in. That's true for both uh, Israeli media in the way it's covering the war in Gaza and Palestinian media in the way it's covering October 7th. Both are presenting a very narrow sliver of what is happening, and both communities are sucking what the media is giving them. And the social media is also amplifying. It's only amplifying the voices of the traditional media because you're in your own bubble. So figuring out how to empower people to figure out new sources of information in this busy information, in this heavy information era is extremely important. And I don't know that we have the answer on how you um get there. Um, but I'm thinking of your question, and I'm thinking of these powerful institutions, both in terms of the government and its ongoing effort that's been going on for decades to dehumanize Palestinians, to delegitimize their political leadership, to hide away Palestinians behind walls. And then when the media is joining that, what power do individuals have to counter that? Um, I think it's a really good question, and I don't know. I'm not saying that morally there's no other responsibility. I'm just pondering out loud how we create a path to that.
Mm.
And I also want to think about why your question is such a good one, in the sense that this is a tectonic time in Israel and Palestine. I mean, everything is. I'm curious what Gidon will say, but my feeling is that we're in an earthquake, and the earth has not stopped moving. So I can't tell you which buildings will collapse, right? I can tell you that some have already collapsed. I'm seeing the ruins, but I don't know what will remain and what will change. And so I think these are opportunities to ask big questions and figure out new paths.
So I think at EcoPeace, that's actually what we've tried to do. And we really have tried to think out of the box at this time, because peace is a dirty word. It's been a dirty word for more than 2 decades, and in the midst of war, one of the key roles that we try to put forward is that peace is possible, is that the public on both sides are not the enemy, and that's a very hard message to bring across to the publics on all sides, and in our case, Israeli, Palestinian, and Jordanian, and therefore we've tried to craft ideas that first of all speak the talk. So we talk together. We come and present as Israelis, Palestinians, and Jordanians. So just seeing us together, seeing Israeli, Palestinian, and Jordanian school teachers come together, young professionals that are keen to deal with the climate crisis in the midst of the war. So highlighting that this type of activity still continues, but also broadening our agenda and realizing that in particular this time, we have to highlight also self-interest and mutual gains. So EcoPeace is the brainchild behind an agreement that was signed just before October 7th of a water energy exchange, where Israel would be selling water to Jordan in order to meet Jordan's horrific water shortage issues, and Israel would be buying renewable energy from Jordan to meet Israel's commitments to the climate crisis, all based on strong economic rationale that each country can do better. A little bit like coal and steel, which was the basis of moving forward in Europe after World War II. Understanding that we need to create healthy interdependencies. And in the midst of the war, we've tried to identify issues that speak to the self-interests of the various sides. How do we start talking about a Palestinian state? How do we start talking about the rebuilding of Gaza from a Palestinian perspective with Palestinian needs, but also reflect Israeli security concerns? And we took on a much broader agenda called the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, not our idea, a plan of the US government, the European Union, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, India, of economic activity, and have undertaken research that highlight that these types of endeavors that are based on the export of renewables, so they're very climate, they're very environment focused, but that they highlight the mutual gain that Netanyahu comes to the UN and shows a map of the evil, of the axis of evil with Iran. He shows another map, which is actually the India, Middle East, Europe map. But on that map, there's no Palestine. And we come and show that Haifa port, which is what he's focused on, can be a major point of connectivity and prosperity to Israel. But that's not at the expense, and on the contrary, if we turn Gaza port into that same node of shared prosperity, and we link the future economies of Saudi Arabia and its export of renewables, not just via Israel, but also via Palestine and via Gaza in particular. If we have a railway across the Middle East that comes to Haifa, but also comes to Gaza, then we have a transformative change taking place. And it's quite, I'd say to you, it's actually not surprising that we're able to speak to all of our governments on the opportunities that and the self-interest that they, the Israeli government sees, the Abraham Accords here sees the Negev process, the Palestinians see the pathway to the Palestinian state. Israelis see how well if the Saudi economy becomes connected to Gaza and their economic prosperity becomes connected to stability in Gaza, then we see Israeli security folks coming to dialogue with us because it's of the transformative nature of the discussion. So we've heavily invested in research with economic actors, with geopolitical actors, to try to bring this transformative ideas to the table that at the same time speak to advancing the Palestinian state, but also Israeli Saudi normalization and broader normalization with the Arab world as a whole, and are identifying leadership. So this issue we hope will be part of the discussions of the G7. We see statements of the new Commissioner for the Mediterranean of the European Union coming forward and speaking to how we can not see things as a zero-sum game, but put human rights issues, Palestinian state, Israeli security and normalization issues into a deal. And even in our discussions in the State Department with the Trump administration, we see the aspect of deal making of interest. Yes, they don't see eye to eye on Palestinian statehood, but there are issues that we can still bring to the table with them.
It's quite extraordinary that in the midst of war and everything going on, you're still managing to find these ways and plans and projects to move forward. But I have a few more questions, so I'm going to go through them quite quickly. And it's kind of a big question, and you don't necessarily need to give a big answer, but I do feel like connected to this, I want to just ask you about society as a whole and whether you think it's true, as has been widely observed, that there's been a radical transformation of Israeli society, because things that were undiscussable and unthinkable for the majority of Israelis are now discussed. Societies are defined by what is ethically undiscussable to them. And some Israelis have lamented, what have we become? Have we become this? Your colleague, Michelle Lesh, David Schulman, they've written about this. And some individuals have asked themselves, how did I ever become someone who believes this or who considers this? Let them starve. Not one of them deserves my pity. There are no innocents. And I want to ask you, can this be reversed without painful, almost brutal soul searching, which in other societies has taken generations? Is there a way back from this?
So first of all, I think that, through this harrowing year and a half, I've not heard a better idea than peace, democracy, and human rights. Like as a basis as a foundation for a future. Like nothing new has emerged from all the horrors and all the pain, and it's really discouraging that after so much death on both sides, we find ourselves at exactly the same spot. Hamas is strong in Gaza like it was. Palestinians are no closer to a state. Israel's no safer than it was. And we did this huge, unbearably painful turn and find ourselves in the same spot. And, maybe building on what Gidon has said, Israelis have been so reliant on military technology in order to feel safe, right? The Iron Dome system and the drone system. And just in the summer of 2023, Israel finished a huge investment with the US on laser technology that goes under the wall to make sure that there are no tunnels coming into Israel. And all of that has failed. And none of it is foolproof. And it's quite extraordinary that in these 18 months, what has been really resilient is the peace agreements. So I think, it's so extraordinary that with the collapse of all institutions, and the military collapsed completely on October 7th, and maybe afterwards it came back, but the peace agreements have not collapsed even for a moment. And so I think that as we have a longer time to process this, there will be an opportunity to discuss these issues. What makes us feel secure and what fails us every time. And I also, want to remind all of us that in 73, a peace with Egypt, telling somebody in 73 that in 4 years there will be a peace agreement with Egypt would have been laughable. Mm-hmm. So again, these war times are completely tectonic, and we don't know where this ends. But I also agree with you that there's been a shift in Israeli society, and it will take generations to repent for what we've done. And this is what we'll have to be engaged in the midst of this crisis that is global. And so in this unprecedented and unpredictable time, what we're holding on to is, first of all, our values and our commitment to them, our commitment to each other and to our friends in the field. And our understanding that these anti-democratic waves are extremely powerful, and others have faced them before, and we are ready, we are strong, we're more educated and more powerful than we've ever been in the past to survive this one as well.
I'm going to jump in there. Okay, yeah, go quickly.
I just want to add that, we have to hold ground, and we have to continue, certainly from the perspective of EcoPeace, to show that peace is possible. Because if we allow those forces to continue to dampen any possibility of dialogue, of any hope for the future, then that just further empowers them, and therefore, perhaps this is something that you're going to ask me later, but what really gives me hope is that in the middle of the war, we're able to bring young people. We have to bring them to Cyprus at the moment because we can't hold our regional gatherings in Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. But we bring 60 teachers together, and our programs on the education side are completely oversubscribed. There are more Palestinians, there are more Israelis, there are more Jordanians that want to join the program than we can possibly take on board. And I think that it's not at all lost. I think that we have a real responsibility. Those voices were there before. They're louder today. They feel that they're more privileged and more able, to speak them publicly. But they're not new voices. They're voices that we've had to deal with for our whole lives. But I think, again, as Noah said, the horrific loss has kept us all in the same place, and people understand that. People are seeing that our security is not advanced, that our leadership is failing us, and we're seeing that on the Israeli side. We're seeing that on the Palestinian side. I think we're seeing that on the broader regional side as well. And we need to provide those answers. We need to hold that leadership to account, but also bring in the ideas that can force the leaders to move forward.
Well, I want to thank you both for giving us a little bit of hope right now. And unfortunately, that's all we have time for. We could go on. And I want to invite Michael back now to close the conversation.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Gidon. Good to see you.
Yes, thank you all for being on. I really could think of no better note to go out on than that we have no alternative but to keep going forward. Yes, the history has proven just how right you are in your work, how true this work is, and how desperately we need this. We are so grateful to have you as NIF grantees, as panelists, as participants, and as people doing the incredible work on the ground. Friends, thank you for being on. You heard so much about the attacks that Gidon and Noah are facing daily, organizationally, politically, and so the need is great. If you can please chip in any amount, you could do so at nif.org.au, which I've just dropped into the chat, or reach out to me directly to discuss supporting these critical organizations. The need is unprecedented, truly. So thank you for being on. Thank you for being part of our community. Thank you to Michelle for a wonderful moderation and for a beautifully facilitated conversation. We so appreciate your time this evening and this afternoon over in Israel and Palestine. And we look forward to continuing to work together to help to support at this urgent moment. Thank you all. Have a great night.
Thank you. Toda rabah.